In the winter of 1959, Soviet officials gathered to finalize plans for what would become one of the largest irrigation projects in human history. The Virgin Lands campaign had already transformed millions of acres of steppe into farmland. Now engineers proposed an even more ambitious undertaking, redirecting the flow of Central Asia's two greatest rivers to expand cotton production across the desert republics of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. The Darya and Darya had sustained civilizations for thousands of years, feeding into the Aral Sea, a body of water larger than Lake Michigan. Soviet planners viewed these rivers differently. Water flowing into the sea, they argued, was water wasted. By diverting it into irrigation canals, they could turn arid land productive and demonstrate the superiority of centralized planning over nature itself. The plan proceeded without environmental review. Construction of the massive Karakum Canal began in the 1950s and continued for decades, eventually stretching over 800 miles across Turkmenistan. Smaller canals branched throughout Uzbekistan. The system worked exactly as designed, delivering water to cotton fields that had never seen cultivation. Cotton production soared. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union had become one of the world's largest cotton exporters. Regional officials reported record harvests year after year. The numbers satisfied Moscow's quotas, and few questioned the sustainability of drawing down two major river systems to maintain desert agriculture. The Aral Sea began to shrink in the 1960s. Satellite images from that decade show the shoreline receding steadily. Fishing villages that had operated for generations found themselves miles from water. By the 1970s, the sea had lost a quarter of its volume. Engineers noted the change, but viewed it as an acceptable trade-off. The economic value of cotton, they calculated, outweighed the loss of a landlocked sea. Records indicate that scientists raised concerns as early as 1968. Hydrologists warned that the diversion rates exceeded the river's capacity to replenish the sea. Biologists documented the collapse of fish populations. These reports reached planning committees in Moscow. But cotton remained a strategic priority. The Soviet economy depended on export revenue, and changing course would mean acknowledging a fundamental miscalculation. The irrigation system itself suffered from severe inefficiencies that planners had not anticipated. The canals, many built through sandy soil without proper lining, lost nearly half their water to seepage and evaporation. Farmers, pressured to meet production targets, used far more water than necessary. The infrastructure aged poorly, developing leaks that no one had budget to repair. By 1987, the Aral Sea had split into two separate bodies of water. The southern portion continued to shrink rapidly. Fishing towns became desert outposts. Ships rusted in sand that had been seabed a generation earlier. The exposed lakebed, saturated with agricultural chemicals from decades of runoff, dried into toxic dust that wind carried across the region. The environmental consequences accumulated, slowly. Then suddenly, salt storms became common, damaging crops hundreds of miles away and causing respiratory illness in children. The climate grew more extreme as the sea's moderating influence disappeared. Summers became hotter and drier. Winters turned harsher. The same land that cotton had made profitable became harder to farm each year. Historians suggest that officials understood the full scope of the disaster by the mid-1980s, but the political system made reversal nearly impossible. Admitting failure would implicate decades of policy and hundreds of officials who had built careers on the project's success. Cotton production continued even as the ecological foundation supporting it dissolved. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the newly independent republics inherited a crisis without the centralized resources to address it. Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan still depended on cotton for foreign currency. Kazakhstan faced an environmental catastrophe within its borders. The infrastructure remained in place because replacing it was economically impossible, and the rivers continued to decline. International efforts to restore the Aral Sea began in the 1990s, but the scale of intervention required exceeded available funding. A dam completed in 2005 partially recovered the northern section, demonstrating that restoration was theoretically possible. The larger Southern Sea, however, had passed a threshold. By 2014, its eastern basin had dried completely for the first time in 600 years. Evidence points to losses far exceeding the project's economic gains. The fishing industry that once employed 60,000 people disappeared entirely. Agriculture became less productive as soil quality degraded and water grew scarcer. Health costs from pollution and climate change burdened healthcare systems that were already underfunded. The total economic damage, calculated across 6 decades, runs into hundreds of billions of dollars. The mistake was not a single decision, but a system that prioritized short-term targets over long-term sustainability. Each year's cotton quota mattered more than warnings about the next decade. Each official's career depended on meeting production goals, not questioning whether those goals made sense. The infrastructure itself, once built, created momentum that proved nearly impossible to stop. What began as an ambitious plan to master nature through engineering became a demonstration of how large-scale projects can fail slowly, visibly, yet irreversibly. The rivers still flow, but they no longer reach the sea. The canals still carry water, but they serve a landscape fundamentally altered by their existence. The Aral Sea, once the 4th largest lake in the world, remains a fraction of its former size, a consequence that decades of planning failed to prevent.